Thank you for listening to this worship podcast of St. Andrew Lutheran Church. We hope this recording provides you with a moment of God's grace wherever this finds you. Know that you're welcome to join us in person for worship in Eden Prairie on Sunday mornings at 9 or 10:30. And also know that any contribution you make will bolster St. Andrew's ministry and outreach, including our podcasting directly to you. You can do so online. Welcome and God's blessings to you.
The gospel reading is from Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 22 and 27 and 28. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you will be liable to the hell of fire. You have heard it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. The word of the Lord.
Good morning. Welcome to our 8 a.m. service this morning. Every year I think, why do we do this? And then we fall back then in the fall, and it's awesome. It's great. The reward for the springtime, spring forward. Welcome to worship this season of Lent. Purple is the color now. It is 40 days of the season of Lent. The traditional call during Lent is to turn back to God, to be part of God's community in impacting in intentional ways, to find focus again on the grace and love of Jesus. So we begin our sermon series on Wednesday night with Ash Wednesday, when we put those ashes on our forehead, read the Beatitudes, but blessed are those who mourn, those who are meek, those who are in need, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. And we pick that up again all during the season of Lent. More on that as we make our way forward. But I've been thinking a bit about how a lot of things in our life can sometimes end up being a little bit rote. They're a little bit more ordinary, and we make our way without thinking very much about roots and background. For instance, I was thinking a bit about how perhaps you have in all of your kitchens recipe books of recipes that were written by great-grandmas or grandmas or your mom that are part of old recipe books. Sometimes I think, the New York Times cooking app is what we do, but we also have some of those old recipes. Do you know what I'm talking about? Do you ever look at those old recipes? For myself, one of the things that I have been engaging in at St. Andrew, and you know this about me, many of you do, about my bread baking and how I've enjoyed baking bread here at St. Andrew. And during the pandemic especially, we had all these online classes where people could bake in their own kitchens. It was really fun for Pat and me, Pat Day on the right, and of course myself. We would go on Teams or on Zoom, and we would do these bread classes. But I was thinking back to about 20 years ago when I got together with Pat for the first time. He was a member of our congregation in South Minneapolis, Nokomis Heights Lutheran Church. And I went to his kitchen because Michelle had given me a birthday present to learn how to bake with Pat. And he gave me a small yellow folder, and I wrote and wrote and wrote as we had those 3.5, 4 hours together, my first bread recipe. And I haven't seen this recipe for a number of years. Why? Because it's kind of all gets to be up here, doesn't it? So I end up thinking, okay, 350 degrees, that's fine. 6 cups of water, don't go over 115 degrees, 1 cup of honey, so forth and so on. And all the other bread recipes that I've done kind of trickle off of this one. But how fun it was for me to go back and look at things the way that it was back at the very beginning. And I wondered a little bit about our Christian faith. Whether or not it's gotten to the point where we in our faith think of our faith as a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but we maybe don't go back and look at the original recipes. Another example. I had a meeting over in St. Paul here this past week and drove over and had to park in a residential neighborhood close by to where I was going. And there were a lot of cars parked on the streets. And so I had to find a spot in the neighborhood to be able to walk from where I parked to where I was going. And I approached this parking spot. At least I thought it was a parking spot, but it was next to one of these signs. And I started thinking to myself, no one else is parked right here. How many feet from a stop sign can I park? So I asked that question to myself. And then, of course, the backup plan is always find another place to park, which is what I did, of course. But I'll turn my attention not to that question that I had in my mind as I was trying to park, but to you as well. How many feet do you or can you park from a stop sign? Okay, pick the number. Okay, we're going to do, this is in honor of the Twins are playing baseball again, and this is what they do with the Twins at Target Field. So how far can you park from a stop sign? Don't say your answer, just pick the one that you're thinking of. It's not 50. 50 is where? You can't park within 50 feet of a railroad crossing, okay? That's the first one. Okay, now hopefully your one is still there. 10 feet is not from a stop sign. 10 feet is from a fire hydrant. Okay, so remember that one. So we have 2 remaining, 30 feet or 20 feet. How far can we park from a stop sign? 30 feet. That's the answer. 30 feet from a stop sign. 20 is from a crosswalks in an intersection. And so here ends my public service announcement. The neighborhoods all are safer where we live now because we know now where to park. But how many of us, though, too, who have been driving, like for me, for 40 years, and I had to ask myself the question, how far to park from a stop sign? When was the last time that I read the manual? When was the last time I had to take a driver's test? It's been a long time since I had to do all of those things. But I haven't gone back until I was thinking about that this week, as I was thinking about us as Christian people. How often do we live our lives making our way without asking some of the essential kind of early, young, or the basic questions about what undergirds us, about who we stand for, what we stand for, and who we are as faithful people? That we're a little bit on autopilot, that we let ourselves just kind of go around. And the recipe that we follow is that the Christian faith is a little bit of this, or a little bit of that, a cup of this, or a dash of that. And we make our way going through life. And my answer to that is yes, in many ways it is, but my answer is also and. Yes, it is that way as we live our faithful life, and we are called during especially the season of Lent to say, I'd like to know a little bit more. I'd like to follow a little bit more closely. What is it? What is on that old recipe card? What could I learn from those things? What is it that would help me drive a little more safely for the sake of the other? In my faith, where is it that I can find some new strength and some new understanding? This is really important for us. I was thinking about way back in the Old Testament, one of the passages that I had to memorize when we had the Bible literacy exam way back in seminary. Shauna, I don't know if they have a Bible literacy exam now anymore at the seminary, but one of those was Joshua 24:15, and it's this passage here, way back in the book of Joshua. When Joshua is on his deathbed, basically, and he's addressing his family, and he says these words, Now, if you are willing to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your ancestors served in the regions beyond the river, or the gods, the Amorites, in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Make a choice, in other words, is what that passage was. And at Luther Seminary, one of those passages that they wanted us to drill into and memorize and know. And here it is. Here I am 30 years later with that passage that's there. But it still stands today during a season of Lent when we're called to come back into communion with God in a new and a different way. How important it is that we do that. I think context also is king. And I was remembering, too, this week about my Lebanese friends when I was serving in the Middle East before coming to St. Andrew. And I would go to Lebanon and visit our partners and friends there. Various Christian backgrounds in Lebanon. And one of the things that I loved about the particular of two people, Jacques and Anna, were part of a partnership in an organization that the ELCA had in Beirut. And they were very, very strong in their faith because they were growing up in a context where the nation was 40% Christian, had been through a civil war in the 70s and 80s, and they were so ardent and determined to make sure that their church was strong because they said very specifically and very frankly to me that if we didn't bring our kids to church and to Sunday school, if we didn't go to worship or to participate in community life, our church community will disappear. Will disappear. I'll never forget that, where that comes from. It was the same in a way in Egypt where I was, where 10% of the population is Christian. But they lived with such an urgency and an ardentness and just a strength of commitment that if we don't do this, we will no longer be in existence. That's that context. It's not our context. But that's that context, and we learn from diverse voices. We learn from diverse peoples. And I know, at least from my own context here, as I live and breathe, and I'm Peter Johnson, but also Pastor Peter Johnson, senior pastor at St. Andrew Lutheran Church, that there are times when I am hearing voices of Christians in the world today that I, as Peter and Pastor Peter, don't agree with. And I have to go back to the basics, too, and ask the questions, what do I believe? What do I want to be? What does our congregation need to be a strong congregation, a community of welcome, of love, and of justice, and where all people belong, and where we are striving to equip people boldly to be lovers in our world in this day, when there are so many other Christian voices out there that seek to claim the brand of Christianity. That's why we need to be strong. The love and the grace of God is here for us in Christ Jesus. And so we lean into that during the season of Lent, especially. Now, our sermon series is called Following the Way. We are followers of the way, the truth, and the life. And our basis for our sermon series here is Matthew chapter 5, chapter 6, and chapter 7. And my invitation to you, or my commissioning to you, or my command to you, is to take some time with Matthew 5, 6, and 7. I talked about the recipe cards, those old recipes that make the favorite things that we love. This is kind of like a recipe book. It's kind of like instruction manual is the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. There's so many things within it that are part of what it means to be faithful disciples, not just 2,000 years ago, but very much alive and well today. And so Matthews 5, 6, and 7. This is essentially what's in chapter 5 of the Gospel of Matthew. As I mentioned earlier, on Wednesday night, we talked about the blessed are the poor in spirit, the meek, the merciful, the mourning, the peacemakers, those who are enduring persecution, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. Jesus is coming alongside those who are vulnerable and needy and weak. At the very beginning, the intro to his sermon. fascinating thing to begin with for Jesus to implore his disciples and all the crowds who were gathered there to think about those things. And then that you are people of God, you are the salt and the light. You are the salt in the world. What kind of taste, what kind of food would it taste like if we didn't have salt in it? You are the ones who make life go down well. You are the light that shines in the world. There are people that count on us for love and support and encouragement and mercy. So we are the salt and we are the light of the world, which reminds me of this monk from the deserts outside of Cairo, who was teaching us about the Coptic Christian traditions there. And after he gave us this lecture on the roof of the monastery, we went down and he passed out communion bread to us. And he said specifically, in our communion bread, there is no salt, because the salt is Jesus and the salt is you. We don't put salt in the communion. So it reminds that every time we take this bread that has no salt, it doesn't taste great, but it's a reminder for Coptic Christians that you're the salt. You're the ones who are called and sent to be disciples in the world. Jesus is the salt, and we are the salt. Matthew 5 also talks about controlling your anger, friends. Controlling your anger. The context in this setting is committing murder, but it's more generally speaking, control your anger. What is it that makes us angry? How does it affect us in our inside? How does it affect the people around us? Control ourselves so that we can be loving and merciful and forgiving. These are lessons for living in the Sermon on the Mount from Jesus. Also in our reading here from today that Shauna read, control lust. It's adultery that happens. If you look on somebody in a way that is not in kindness and in love and in gentleness, could we be, indeed, as Jesus says, be committing adultery in these ways? Control those things. Matthew 5 goes on to talk about oaths, that oaths in those days were being said for this and being said for that. And Jesus said, just be honest and truthful at all times in the 5th chapter of Matthew, says Jesus. And then also in the 5th chapter is the story that we'll be talking about next week, is we love everyone, including our enemies. Hello. What a lesson for living that is, to love our enemies in this day and age. All of this in the Sermon on the Mount. So how does that look and feel for us as a Christian community? That's just the first chapter of those 3 chapters of the Sermon on the Mount. But some lessons for living, some ways to lean into community life and understanding. So join us in this process of learning and growing and following the way as we are called to do as people of God. So I would be remiss also too to not remind us that we're part of a Lutheran congregation. So we as Lutherans have a beautiful way of turning the page. We follow. And we're called to follow and be the people of God in the ways that we are able. But we also are invited, like in a mirror, to look into the mirror and see in the mirror what we see when we look in that mirror. We see the beauty that we are beloved in the eyes of God, but we also look in the mirror and we see our flaws. The Sermon on the Mount has often been called also like a mirror. That while it is an invitation and an urging to do these things that are important when we follow the way, when we follow Jesus, it's also like a mirror because it also says that there are times in life and in circumstance where we can't and we don't. The shoulda, coulda, wouldas. Or I wish I had another chance. Or I wish that this hadn't happened this way, but I don't know how else to make it happen now. And so as Lutherans, you are in a Lutheran church. You're part of a Lutheran community that extends this love and this embrace that comes upon us despite our efforts to do all that we are called to do in the Sermon on the Mount and beyond. I remember a story from one of our members here at St. Andrew. And I don't know when I told the story. It might have been a devotion or maybe it was in a sermon. I can't remember. But it was a story of when I was way back about 20 years ago. It might have been a time change Sunday, too, when we're all a little bit groggy and we're not quite sure which end is up when our minds are sleepless. But I remember I got to church that morning. I wasn't here at St. Andrew. It was another church. I got to church that morning, and I had two different shoes on. Has that ever happened to you before? Two different shoes on. So this is a photograph there of two matching shoes. That is not what I had for the early service at Nokomis Heights that particular morning. I called Michelle and said, Michelle, could you please bring one shoe or the other shoe? I don't care which one. But eventually she came in. We had kids and they were young, and so I was tired, and there I was with two different shoes on for one whole service. This member at St. Andrew oftentimes will greet me with a handshake, and then they'll go like this. Good job, Peter. Good job, Pastor Peter. You got dressed well here this morning. But the other thing, though, that John Bell Wilson has said as a part of that conversation, and in many other conversations too, that I appreciate, as we try to live out our faith in daily life and put our shoes on in the right way, or serve God in the ways that our neighbors deserve us to serve God. This phrase that he will say to me is, there's only one perfect person. And that's the gospel, my friends. The only perfect person is Jesus. And that's what makes us so great. That we have a God who invites us, who implores us, who calls us to follow these ways. But also that there is only one perfect person, his Son, who loves us. And if Jesus is perfect, then Jesus' love is perfect even for me and for you. That's our faith. That's what keeps us getting out of bed in the morning. That's what keeps us going forward day after day, opportunity after opportunity, as we live our faith out in daily life. And so the sermon title today is We Obey. So I'm not backing down from that. We obey. That's who we are. We strive. But I also want to add a little bit to that and simply say, getting there. There's something to be said about getting there. There's like a GPS that's getting us to our destination. We're getting there. But also we can say to ourselves honestly, I'm getting there. I'm getting there. Because I think that's the journey, that's the path, that's the route of faith and life. That's not just 40 days of turning back to Jesus, but it's Jesus saying again and again, I'm the only perfect one. My love for you is perfect. It is more than enough than you'll ever need in your life and in your grace. Follow me. Follow. Love others as I have loved you. And all of that is to say that we're getting there in the grace of God. So come along on the journey here, this season of Lent, and in community here together as we serve Christ, God our Father, and our neighbors. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you for listening to this worship podcast of St. Andrew Lutheran Church. We hope that this recording provides you with a moment of God's grace wherever this finds you. Any contribution you make to St. Andrew will bolster our ministry and outreach, including our podcasting directly to you. You can do so online. Thank you for joining us for this podcast, and I wish you every blessing from Christ today.